And then, almost insulting in its coldness, the palace broke its silence, not with compassion, not with reassurance, but with a statement so clinical, so detached it felt like ice. A statement that neither confirmed the fear nor erased it. A statement that read as though written by lawyers who had been awake for days, carefully choosing their words as if diffusing a bomb. Why would a child need legal language? This was never meant to go public. But behind the scenes, whispers began to creep from within the palace walls. Not accusations, not outright claims, just careful suggestions. Whispers about a decision, whispers about a protected environment, whispers about what's best for the institution. And that word, institution, is where the rot begins to show. Because what happens when what's best for a child clashes with what's best for the crown? Then one day at the school gates, a parent noticed something strange. The usual friendly smiles from the staff were gone. In their place, tight faces, eyes that wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. What were they told not to say? In the monarchy, the most terrifying words are never bad news. It's no comment, because no comment isn't an answer, it's a locked door. And locked doors only mean one thing: something is hidden behind them, something you aren't allowed to see. So what exactly was happening behind that door? Some say it all began with exhaustion, overstimulation, the relentless pressure of public life, forcing a child to perform a role before he even understood it. Others quietly suggest a health concern, nothing scandalous, just something serious enough to change everything. But then you hear the third version, the one no one states outright, only implies with careful pauses. It wasn't just about health, it was about control. And if control was involved, who was losing it? Picture this: a palace corridor at night. No tourists, no cameras, only the soft hum of lights and the distant echo of footsteps. A staff member carries a folder, thin, unremarkable, but it's held like it's heavy. Inside that folder, a decision that will haunt someone for decades. On the front, a stamp, unreadable, unphotographed, just enough to make you wonder, was that folder for Louis? Or about Louis? Because here's what people forget: when the palace moves, it doesn't just shift in pieces. It moves like a living, breathing organism. First, security tightens, then staff schedules adjust, then public appearances are rescheduled. Finally, the story that the public is allowed to hear is carefully controlled. So if Louis was gone from the public eye, what shifted behind the scenes first? A royal watcher pointed out something small, something that slipped by unnoticed. A routine charity engagement suddenly rescheduled. No explanation, no details. Another noticed an unusual increase in security at a private entrance. Men who didn't look like they were there for ceremony. A photographer described a moment when a car left at purpose-driven speed. Not chaotic, not emergency speed, but purposeful. Someone wanted to arrive before anyone could ask questions. Arrive where? And then came the strangest detail of all. The palace didn't flood the media with distractions. No staged smiling photos. No family baking cookies PR stunts. No updates to calm the public. Nothing. And that's not how modern royalty behaves when they want to stop speculation. So why didn't they try to calm the panic? Unless calming the panic would require telling a lie so big it couldn't be undone. So they chose silence. But silence creates its own monster. And that monster only has one appetite: the truth. And now imagine being inside that family. One child learning duty like a script. One child learning poise like armor, and the youngest, once the symbol of spontaneity, suddenly turned into a missing page in a story the palace kept reprinting. What kind of decision turns a child into an edit? People started rewatching old clips, not because they wanted drama, but because they wanted evidence. They noticed the last moments when Louis looked tired in a way children usually aren't. Not sleepy tired, not long day tired, but more like carrying something. And then the comments changed from jokes to genuine worry, because the world recognized that look. The look of someone who has been told something they can't fully understand but can feel. What was he told? And then came the moment that truly twisted the knife. When the palace finally spoke, it didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like a boundary, a clean line drawn across the public's curiosity. Do not cross. But why draw a boundary unless people are getting too close to something real? Some royal observers began hinting at a permanent adjustment. Not temporary, not a break, but a reshaping of how Louis would exist in public life, if at all. And once that idea enters the room, the air changes, because you start asking a question that sounds impossible until history reminds you it is. Has the monarchy ever hidden someone before? And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable, because yes, history is full of royal figures who were protected, relocated, quietly removed from view for their own good. Sometimes it's compassion, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's reputation management disguised as care. But in every case, there's one constant: the public learns the truth too late. So what timeline are we on right now? Now here's the controversy without accusing anyone. If a child needs privacy, that's human. That's understandable. But if a palace uses privacy as a shield, then privacy becomes a weapon. And when a weapon is used, it's used against something. Against the press, against the public, or against the child's future. Because protected time away sounds gentle until you realize it can also mean something else. A life being rewritten without consent. A childhood being relocated into controlled spaces. A personality being trained out of someone. A problem being solved quietly. But solved for whom? People close to royal life, again no direct claims, just careful suggestions, have long said that the institution has one sacred priority: stability, not happiness, not freedom, stability, and stability demands predictability. So what happens when the youngest royal is unpredictable in a way that can't be choreographed? Because Louis wasn't just a child, he was a symbol the public adored. Genuine, messy, real, and real is dangerous in a world built on appearances. So ask yourself, did he disappear because something was wrong or because he was too real for the machine? Then something else happened quietly, something most people didn't notice until it was pointed out. A certain kind of rumor stopped being denied, not confirmed, just left alone. And in royal PR, what's left alone is often what can't be fought without drawing blood. So what rumor was the palace afraid to touch? And if you're expecting a neat answer, don't, because the most believable royal scandals are the ones wrapped in enough truth to feel inevitable. Maybe it was health, maybe it was stress, maybe it was safety, maybe it was a private family choice. But then explain this: why did the palace's wording feel like it was protecting more than just a child? Because when they said best interest, it read like a compromise. A compromise implies conflict, and conflict implies sides. So who was on which side? Now imagine the room where the decision was made. No dramatic shouting, no tabloid theatrics, just a quiet table, a silent pause after a doctor's sentence, a mother staring at the floor, a father staring at the wall, an aide waiting for instructions like a machine. And somewhere in that silence, the monarchy chose what kind of truth the world could handle. But what kind of truth makes adults go silent like that? And here's the part that makes your stomach tighten. If the palace truly believed this was only about protection, why did it feel like removal? Why did it feel like erasure? Why did it feel like the world was being trained to forget his place in the picture? Because forgetting is a strategy. First, the public gets used to absence. Then the absence becomes normal. Then the name becomes rare. Then the story becomes untouchable. Then one day you're told it was always this way. So are we watching that strategy unfold in real time? And just when the speculation reached its peak, a new question landed like a blade. If Louis is protected, why do we see no harmless proof of life? No simple human reassurance that doesn't reveal location, doesn't reveal details, doesn't violate privacy? A sentence, a smile, a small update. Why not even that? Unless even a small update risks revealing a larger truth. Unless the truth isn't just private. Unless it's complicated. And complicated truths are the ones that split families, split institutions, split futures. So what complication could be big enough to make the palace choose total silence? Now listen, this is where the story becomes less about a child and more about power. Because the monarchy doesn't fear scandal the way you think it does. It can survive scandal. What it cannot survive is uncertainty. The sense that the public is watching the crown lose control. And right now the public is watching an empty space where a child used to stand. So the biggest question isn't where is Louis, it's what did his absence prevent the world from seeing? And that brings us to the final haunting possibility. Again, not an accusation, just a question no one wants to ask. What if this wasn't a disappearance? What if it was a decision, and the decision wasn't made because something happened to him, but because something was happening around him? Because in every royal story, the darkest truths are never shouted. They're whispered, they're signed, they're filed, they're sealed, and the people involved don't act like villains. They act like adults doing what's necessary, but necessary for who? Oh, here's what we know in this dramatized world. A child vanished from the public eye. The palace spoke in code. The silence became policy, and the empty space became a message. But what we don't know is the only thing that matters. A respected child behavior specialist later replayed that balcony footage frame by frame, and what she suggested made the room go quiet, not because it was sensational, but because it was specific. She pointed to the withdrawal. The way Louis's gaze didn't lock onto anything. The way his shoulders sat too high for a child who usually bounced with energy. The tiny fidgets that didn't look playful. They looked like self-soothing, not restless, not bored, more like bracing. So the question became impossible to avoid. Was this just a shy moment or the first visible crack in something far bigger? She described it as retreating inward, the kind of emotional shutdown you sometimes see when a child is overwhelmed but forced to stay present. The posture wasn't relaxed, it was contained, like he'd been instructed to keep the chaos inside. And the most unsettling part wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. No spontaneous glance, no playful reaction. No spark, just a stillness that felt rehearsed. And if a child is rehearsing stillness, what happened behind the scenes that made stillness feel safer than being himself? But it wasn't only Louis that people started watching after that. It was Catherine. To most viewers, she looked composed, smiling, graceful, perfectly placed in the choreography of the monarchy. But when the footage slowed down, there was a moment so brief you could miss it unless you were hunting for it. Her eyes flicked toward Louis, not with that proud, there he is warmth, but with something sharper, something searching, a mother's glance. And then, almost insulting in its coldness, the palace broke its silence. But it wasn't with warmth, empathy, or even an attempt to reassure the public. No, it came with a statement so clinical, so calculated, it felt almost like a slap in the face. A statement so devoid of emotion it was like ice settling over a wound that was still fresh. It didn't confirm the fear that everyone was sensing, but it didn't erase it either. It lingered, that fear, because the statement felt empty. As though it had been written by lawyers who'd spent countless sleepless nights, choosing each word with surgical precision like they were defusing a bomb. Why would a mere child, need such legal language? It felt so intentional. It was as if the palace wasn't trying to communicate with the people, it was trying to control them, to maintain an illusion of order. This wasn't something meant to go public. It was always meant to be hidden, sealed away, tucked behind closed doors where no one could look too closely. But of course, secrets can never be contained forever. Behind those same walls, whispers began to emerge, quiet at first but gradually louder. Not accusations, not direct claims, just careful, hushed suggestions. Whispers about a decision that had been made, one that had nothing to do with Louis as a child but with him as a symbol. Whispers about a carefully guarded environment, a cocoon in which he could be shielded from the world. And inevitably, whispers about what's best for the institution. The institution, that word, that cold, sterile word, is where the rot begins to seep through the cracks. Because what happens when what's best for a child, his health, his happiness, his well-being, clashes with what's best for the crown, for the image of the monarchy, that's where the real tragedy begins. When a child, a symbol of innocence and promise, becomes an obstacle to an institution's carefully maintained image. Then one day, a parent standing at the school gates noticed something strange. It was subtle but unmistakable. The usual smiles from the staff, the warmth that they usually exuded, gone. In its place were tight, guarded expressions, eyes that wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. It was as if they were afraid to look at anyone, or perhaps afraid of what might slip out if they did. What had they been told not to say? In the monarchy, the most terrifying phrase isn't bad news, it isn't a scandal. It's no comment, because no comment isn't an answer, it's a locked door. And locked doors mean one thing: something is hidden behind them, something the world is not allowed to see, something the public is never supposed to know. So what exactly was happening behind that door? Some people have their own theories. They say it all started with exhaustion, overstimulation, the pressure of a life lived constantly in the public eye, the relentless demands of royalty, forcing a child to play a role before he even had the chance to understand what it meant. Others have quietly suggested a health concern. Nothing scandalous, nothing to cause alarm, just something serious enough to change the course of everything. A concern that, in the right hand, DS could be turned into a very convenient shield, a reason for why things were suddenly so different. But then there's a third version, a version that no one dares to state outright but can be felt in the long pauses between words. This version doesn't just point to health, it points to something far more uncomfortable. It was about control. And if control was at play, then the real question becomes, who was losing it? Who was losing the power to steer the narrative, the image, the future? Picture this: the palace corridor late at night. No tourists wandering the halls, no cameras capturing every moment, no bright lights flashing and flickering. Just the soft hum of the lights overhead and the distant echo of footsteps reverberating through the empty space. A staff member walking alone carries a thin folder, unremarkable, almost insignificant, but held in such a way that it feels far heavier than it appears. Inside that folder, a decision. A decision that will haunt someone for decades. And on the front of that folder, a stamp, unreadable, unphotographed, not for public consumption, just enough to make you wonder, was that folder meant for Louis, or was it about Louis? Here's what people forget about the monarchy. When it moves, it doesn't just shift in small, visible pieces. No, it moves like a living, breathing organism, each part shifting in order to preserve the whole. First, the security tightens. You don't notice it at first, but it's there. Then the staff schedules begin to shift too, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the signs are there. Then public appearances are rescheduled, their purpose becoming unclear. Finally, the story that the public gets to hear, it's carefully crafted, carefully controlled. So if Louis suddenly vanishes from the public eye, what exactly shifted behind the scenes first? A royal watcher noticed something small, something that most people would overlook. A routine charity engagement suddenly rescheduled. No explanation, no details. Another saw an unusual increase in security presence at a private entrance. Not men who appeared to be there for the usual ceremonial duties, but men who seemed to be there for something else entirely. Then a photographer described a moment when a car left the palace at speed. Not in an emergency rush, not in panic, but with a purposeful drive, a sense of direction, like someone wanted to get somewhere before anyone could ask any questions. Arrive where, and why the rush? And then came the strangest detail of all. The palace didn't flood the media with distractions. No staged smiling photos of the royal family baking cookies. No comforting little updates about Louis reassuring the public that everything was fine. Nothing. In a world where modern royalty controls every image, every word, every moment, it was conspicuous, that silence. And silence isn't a typical response to public panic. So why didn't they try to calm the public to ease the worries? Perhaps calming the panic would have required a lie so massive that it couldn't be undone. So instead, they chose silence. But silence creates its own monster. A monster with a single, relentless appetite, the truth. Now imagine being inside that family. One child learning duty like it was a script written for him, his every move preordained. One child learning poise like it was armor to shield himself from the chaos of the world. And the youngest, once the symbol of joy, spontaneity, and energy, suddenly turned into a missing page, a blank spot in the family narrative, as if he had never existed in the public eye. What kind of decision, what kind of force would turn a child into an absence? People began rewatching old footage of Louis, not because they wanted to stir up drama, but because they were searching for evidence. They started to notice the last moments when Louis looked tired in a way that children usually aren't. Not tired like after a long day, not sleepy-eyed and dragging, but tired in a way that seemed heavier, as though he was carrying something far more difficult to bear than any child should have to. And then the comments began to change. What had once been playful jokes about his little quirks turned into genuine concern. The world was beginning to recognize the look, the unmistakable expression of someone who had been told something they couldn't fully understand but could feel deep down inside. What was Louis told? What weight had been placed on his small shoulders? And then came the moment that truly twisted the knife. When the palace finally spoke, it didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like a boundary, a firm line drawn across the public's curiosity. Do not cross. But why draw that line unless people are getting too close to something real, something that they shouldn't be able to uncover? Some royal observers began to hint at a permanent adjustment, not a temporary absence, not a break, but a complete reshaping of how Louis would exist in public life if he was allowed to exist there at all. And once that idea entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. People started to ask a question that sounded impossible, until history reminded us that it wasn't. Has the monarchy ever hidden someone before? And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because yes, history is filled with royal figures who were protected, relocated, quietly removed from public view for their own good. Sometimes it's out of compassion, sometimes it's out of fear, sometimes it's about reputation management disguised as care. But in every case, one truth remains constant. The public learns the truth far too late. So what timeline are we on now? Now here's the controversy without making any accusations. If a child needs privacy, that's human, it's understandable. But if the palace uses privacy as a shield, then privacy becomes a weapon. And when a weapon is used, it's always aimed at something. Is it aimed at the press, at the public, or at the child's future? Because protected time away sounds gentle, even necessary, until you realize it can mean something else entirely. A life being rewritten without consent. A childhood being shifted into controlled spaces. A personality being trained out of someone. A problem being quietly solved. But solved for whom? People close to royal life, again no direct claims, just careful suggestions, have long said that the institution has one sacred priority: stability, not happiness, not freedom, stability, and stability demands predictability. So what happens when the youngest royal is unpredictable in a way that can't be choreographed? Because Louis wasn't just a child, he was a symbol beloved by the public, genuine, messy, real, and real is dangerous in a world built on appearances. So ask yourself, did Louis disappear because something was wrong or because he was too real for the machine? Then something else happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, something most people didn't notice until it was pointed out. A certain kind of rumor once denied fervently suddenly stopped being refuted, not confirmed, just left alone. And in royal PR, what's left alone is often the very thing that can't be fought without drawing blood, certainly. Here's the expanded version, with more details and depth added to enhance the emotional tension and complexity of the narrative. So what rumor was the palace so terrified to touch? And if you're expecting a neatly wrapped up, easy answer, don't hold your breath, because the most dangerous royal scandals are often the ones that are shrouded in just enough truth to make them feel inevitable, to make them feel like something the public should have seen coming. Maybe it was health, an illness too serious to ignore but too delicate to be made public. Maybe it was stress, an overwhelming burden for a child who was already being pushed into the role of a future monarch. Maybe it was safety, something lurking in the shadows that needed to be kept from the world at all costs. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a private family choice, a decision to shield Louis from the harshness of the monarchy's demands. But then, explain this. Why did the palace's official wording feel like it was protecting more than just a child? Because when they spoke of his best interest, it didn't read as a comforting reassurance. No, it read like a compromise. And a compromise in the world of royalty always implies conflict. Conflict means sides, and that's where it gets really uncomfortable. Who is on which side of this conflict? Now imagine the room where the decision was made. It wasn't a scene from a tabloid frenzy, no shouting, no accusations being thrown around, no dramatic theatrics, just a quiet, almost eerie stillness as a family faced something monumental. A table in a dimly lit room, a silent pause after a doctor's somber sentence, a mother, her eyes fixed on the floor, too afraid to look up. A father staring off into the distance, his gaze unfocused, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't bring himself to voice. An aide standing silently, waiting for instructions like a machine devoid of emotion or thought, just waiting, and somewhere in that oppressive silence, the monarchy made its choice. A choice about what kind of truth the world could handle. But what kind of truth makes adults go so silent? What kind of weight presses down so hard on them that they cannot even speak, let alone act? And here's the part that should make your stomach tighten. If the palace truly believed that this whole ordeal was about nothing more than protection, why did it feel so much like removal? Why did it feel like erasure? Why did it feel like the world was being methodically trained to forget Louis's place in the royal story, to erase him from the narrative bit by bit? Because forgetting in the hands of the monarchy is not an accident. Forgetting is a strategy. First, the public gets used to the absence. At first, it's subtle, a fleeting thought that something is missing, but it's easier to ignore. Then the absence becomes normal. It's almost as if it was always meant to be that way. Then the name, once so widely known, becomes rare. You hear it less and less until it starts to fade into a faint echo of something from the past. And then one day you're told with absolute certainty that it was always this way. So here's the question we should all be asking ourselves. Are we watching that strategy unfold before our eyes in real time? And just when the speculation reached its peak, a new question, sharp and cold, landed with the precision of a blade. If Louis is truly being protected, why do we see no harmless proof of life? No simple human reassurance, a sentence, a smile, an update that doesn't reveal his location, doesn't divulge sensitive details, doesn't violate his privacy in any way? Why hasn't the palace given us that? Why not even a small gesture to show he's safe, to remind the world he's still there? Unless just maybe even the smallest update risks revealing something far larger, something too complicated to explain away. Unless the truth in this case is far more than just private. Unless the truth is complicated. And complicated truths are the ones that tear families apart, split institutions down the middle, and fracture futures beyond repair. So what kind of complication could be so immense that the palace would choose to remain completely silent? Now listen closely, because this is where the story shifts. It becomes less about Louis the child and more about the nature of power itself. Because the monarchy, this ancient institution, doesn't fear scandal the way the public believes. It doesn't fear the kind of scandals that can be swept under the rug, dealt with quietly behind closed doors. The monarchy can survive scandal. What it cannot survive is uncertainty. The overwhelming sense that the public is watching with eyes wide open as the crown loses control, as it crumbles under the weight of its own carefully constructed facade. And right now the public is watching that empty space where Louis used to stand. A blank spot in the royal narrative, an absence that feels like it's becoming permanent. So the most important question is, where is Louis? The real question is, what does his absence prevent the world from seeing? And that leads us to the final chilling possibility. Again, not an accusation, but a question that no one wants to ask, but one that begs to be asked. What if this wasn't a disappearance at all? What if instead it was a decision? What if Louis wasn't taken away because something happened to him, but because something was happening around him, something far more insidious? Because let's be clear, in every royal story, the darkest truths are never shouted from the rooftops. No, they're whispered, they're signed in secret, they're filed away in dusty archives, they're sealed, locked away from prying eyes. And the people involved, the ones making the decisions, don't act like villains, they don't see themselves as wrong. They act like adults doing what they believe is necessary, but necessary for who? So here's what we know about this world, the world we're all watching unfold. A child once beloved and adored by the public vanishes from the public eye. The palace speaks in code. The silence becomes policy, and that empty space left behind becomes the message. But what we don't know, what we'll never know until it's too late, is the one thing that matters the most. A respected child behavior specialist, upon watching that balcony footage, replayed it frame by frame. And what she suggested in that moment made the room go deathly quiet. It wasn't because her conclusions were sensational, it was because they were specific. She pointed to Louis's withdrawal, the way his gaze never locked onto anything in particular, the way his shoulders were stiff, higher than they should have been for a child usually so full of energy. The tiny fidgets that didn't seem playful, they didn't look like boredom. They looked like self-soothing, like he was trying to calm himself, to brace himself for something. And then the question became impossible to ignore. Was this just a shy moment, a fleeting discomfort that every child feels at some point? Or was this the first visible crack in something much larger, something far more troubling? The specialist described it as retreating inward. It was the kind of emotional shutdown you sometimes see in children who are overwhelmed by their surroundings but forced to stay present, forced to perform even when their mind and body are screaming to flee. The posture wasn't relaxed, it wasn't natural, it was contained, stiff, like he had been instructed either consciously or unconsciously to keep the chaos inside, to hold it in and not let it show. And the most unsettling part, it was what Louis did, it was what he didn't do. No spontaneous glance at the crowd, no playful reaction to the excitement. And around him, no spark in his eyes, just a stillness, a deep, unsettling stillness that felt rehearsed. And if a child is rehearsing stillness, what was happening behind the scenes that made stillness feel safer than being himself? But it wasn't only Louis that people started to watch more closely. It was Catherine. To the casual viewer, she appeared composed, smiling, graceful, effortlessly playing her part in the carefully choreographed dance of the monarchy. But when the footage was slowed down, there was a moment, brief but undeniable, where her eyes flicked toward Louis. Not with the warm, loving pride that any mother would show when looking at her child. No, this was different. Her gaze was sharp, searching. A mother's glance, a mother who was searching for something in her child's eyes that she couldn't quite find.